Victoria Ashworth stood at the window of her Beacon Hill mansion, watching her daughter's beaten-up Honda Civic pull into the circular driveway. The sight of that car alone made her jaw clench. It was so out of place among the gleaming luxury vehicles that usually graced her property. But what truly made her blood pressure rise was knowing who was behind the wheel. James Connor, her daughter Emma's new boyfriend. "They're here," Victoria called out to her husband Richard, who was absorbed in his Wall Street Journal in the study. Her voice carried that distinct note of displeasure that had become all too familiar over the past few months. As Emma and James approached the front door, Victoria scrutinized the young man through the window. His clothes were clean, but clearly from a department store. Khakis and a button-down shirt that didn't quite fit right. His brown hair needed a trim, and while he carried himself with confidence, it wasn't the polished assurance Victoria expected from someone worthy of her daughter. The door opened, and Emma burst in with her characteristic energy. At 24, she was everything Victoria had hoped for in a daughter: beautiful, intelligent, and Harvard-educated, which made her choice in James all the more incomprehensible. "Mom! Dad!" Emma hugged them both, her smile radiant. "You remember James?" James stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Ashworth, Mr. Ashworth, thank you for having me over for dinner." Victoria took his hand with practiced politeness, noting the roughness of his palm. Manual labor, she thought dismissively. What could he possibly offer her daughter? "Of course, James. We've been looking forward to getting to know you better." The lie rolled smoothly off her tongue, perfected through years of Boston society gatherings. They moved to the formal dining room, where their housekeeper Maria had set the table with the family's finest china and crystal. Victoria watched as James hesitated slightly before taking his seat, clearly uncomfortable in such formal surroundings. "So, James," Richard began, folding his napkin in his lap, "Emma tells us you work at a community center." "Yes, sir. I'm the Director of Veteran Services at the Brighton Community Center." Victoria couldn't help herself. "Director? At your age? That seems unusual." Emma shot her mother a warning look, but James responded with an easy smile. "I started as a volunteer right after I got out of the Marines. When the previous director retired last year, they offered me the position." "The Marines?" Victoria's eyebrows rose. How interesting. And what made you choose that path instead of college?" "Mom!" Emma interjected, but James placed a gentle hand on her arm. "It's okay, Em," he said softly, before turning back to Victoria. "Actually, Mrs. Ashworth, I did go to college, Boston University, on a ROTC scholarship. But after graduating, I felt called to serve. My grandfather was a Marine, and he taught me that there are some debts that can't be repaid, only passed forward." Victoria took a sip of her wine, unimpressed. "And now you work at a community center. The pay must be modest." She ignored her husband's warning cough. "It is," James agreed, maintaining his composure, "but the work is rewarding. We help veterans transition back to civilian life, find employment, deal with PTSD, and reconnect with their families. Money isn't everything, Mrs. Ashworth." "No, but it certainly helps provide stability," Victoria countered. "Emma was raised with certain expectations, certain standards of living. Have you considered how you'll maintain those standards on a non-profit salary?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Emma's face flushed with anger, but before she could speak, a commotion erupted from the kitchen. Maria burst through the door, her face pale. "Mrs. Ashworth, come quick! Mr. Harrison is having some kind of attack." George Harrison was their elderly gardener, who often stayed late tending to Victoria's prized roses. Without hesitation, James sprung from his chair and followed Maria to the kitchen, with the others close behind. They found George on the floor, clutching his chest, his breathing labored. James immediately took charge of the situation, his military training evident in every movement. "Sir, I'm here to help. Can you tell me what you're feeling?" His voice was calm but authoritative as he checked George's pulse and positioned himself to support the older man's head. "Chest. Can't breathe," George gasped. James looked up at Victoria. "Call 911 now. Tell them possible cardiac event." He turned to Richard. "Sir, do you have an AED or first aid kit?" Richard nodded and rushed to retrieve it from his study. James continued talking to George, keeping him conscious and calm, while simultaneously performing a quick medical assessment. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and his presence seemed to fill the kitchen with a sense of control amid the chaos. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. James managed George's condition until the paramedics arrived, then briefed them with military precision on everything he'd observed. As they loaded George into the ambulance, one of the EMTs turned to James. "Good work, Marine. You probably saved his life with your quick response." Victoria stood in her kitchen, watching as James cleaned up the area where George had fallen, still calm and collected, despite the evening's dramatic turn. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way he moved with purpose, the quiet authority in his voice, the natural leadership that had nothing to do with designer clothes or trust funds. Emma helped him clean, their movements in sync, supporting each other without words. Victoria saw the way her daughter looked at him, not with the infatuation she dismissed it as, but with something deeper: respect, trust, and genuine love. As the adrenaline of the emergency faded, Victoria found herself re-evaluating her first impressions of James Connor. Perhaps there was more to this young man than she'd allowed herself to see, but she wasn't ready to admit that yet, not even to herself. This was only the beginning of what would become a profound journey of understanding for Victoria Ashworth, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about value, worth, and what it truly means to be good enough for her daughter. The incident with George had left Victoria unsettled. For the first time, she found herself curious about James Connor beyond his obvious lack of financial status. The following week, unable to focus on her usual charity committee meetings, she decided to do some discreet investigation into her daughter's boyfriend. A quick Google search revealed several local news articles about the Brighton Community Centre's veteran programs. Each one mentioned James, but what caught her attention was a quote from a Marine Corps general praising the centre's innovative approach to veteran rehabilitation. This wasn't just some small-time operation. They were doing something significant. Victoria's friend Margaret, who sat on several non-profit boards, confirmed this over lunch at the Boston Harbor Hotel. "Oh, the Connor boy. Yes, he's making quite a name for himself in veteran services. Did you know he turned down a six-figure position at Raytheon to stay at the center?" This piece of information stopped Victoria's fork midway to her mouth. "He what?" Margaret nodded, clearly enjoying having information Victoria didn't. "Oh yes, and apparently several other defense contractors have tried to recruit him. His work with PTSD recovery programs is revolutionary from what I hear. The VA is looking to implement his methods nationally." Victoria spent the rest of lunch in thoughtful silence, her mind working through this new information. That evening, she found herself parked across the street from the Brighton Community Centre, watching people come and go. She told herself she was just doing her due diligence as a mother, but something deeper pulled at her. The centre occupied an old brick building, modest but well-maintained. Through the large windows, she could see various activities taking place, what looked like a support group in one room, some kind of art therapy in another. Then she spotted James in the main hall, helping an elderly veteran with a wheelchair navigate through the door. Making an impulsive decision, Victoria got out of her car. She had just reached the entrance when a commotion broke out inside. A young man, probably in his early 30s, was having what appeared to be a panic attack, shouting and backing himself into a corner. Victoria froze in the doorway, but James was already moving. His approach to the young man was careful, confident, and calm. "Hey Marcus, you're at the center, you're safe. Remember our breathing exercises? Let's do them together." The young man, Marcus, focused on James's voice, his breathing gradually steadying. James continued talking softly, grounding him in the present moment until the panic subsided. Victoria watched, transfixed, as James then enlisted Marcus's help in organizing some supplies, giving him a purpose to focus on while he recovered his composure. "Mrs. Ashworth?" James had noticed her presence. "Is everything all right? Is Emma okay?" "Yes, everything's fine," Victoria said quickly, suddenly feeling out of place in her designer outfit and pearls. "I was just in the neighborhood." James smiled, but his eyes showed he didn't quite believe her explanation. "Well, since you're here, would you like a tour? We're pretty proud of what we've built." Over the next hour, James showed Victoria around the center. She met veterans of all ages and backgrounds. A former Air Force pilot leading a job skills workshop, a young Army veteran teaching art therapy, a group of Vietnam vets maintaining the center's community garden. Each person they encountered lit up when they saw James, and he knew all their names, their stories, their struggles, and their victories. In the art therapy room, Victoria stopped in front of a striking painting, a chaotic battlefield scene that somehow transformed into a peaceful garden. "That's beautiful," she murmured. "That's Marcus's work," James said quietly. "The man you saw earlier, he was a combat medic in Afghanistan. Lost his entire unit in an ambush. When he first came here, he couldn't even pick up a pencil. His hands shook so badly. Now he's teaching other vets to use art as therapy." Victoria studied the painting more closely, seeing the pain and hope woven together in every brushstroke. "How do you do it? Help them heal?" James was quiet for a moment. "We give them what they need most: purpose, community, and understanding. When you come back from war, the hardest part isn't the memories of what happened. It's feeling like you don't belong anymore, like civilians can't possibly understand. Here they're surrounded by people who get it, and we help them find new ways to serve, to use their skills to help others. That's powerful medicine." As they continued the tour, James showed her a wall covered in photographs. Veterans with their families, at graduation ceremonies, receiving awards, opening businesses. "Our wall of victories," he explained. "Every success story matters, no matter how small." Victoria noticed a familiar face. George, their gardener, in a much younger Marine uniform. "George? I had no idea." "He's one of our regulars," James nodded. "Comes to the Vietnam Vets Support Group every week. The gardening program was actually his idea. Said working with growing things helps quiet the memories." Victoria felt something shift inside her as she looked at George's photo, remembering how James had handled his medical emergency. She had dismissed him as just a gardener, just as she had dismissed James as just a community center worker. How many other stories, other depths had she missed in her rush to judge by surface appearances? The tour ended in James's office, a modest space with a desk covered in papers and a wall full of thank you cards. One caught Victoria's eye, a child's drawing of a superhero with "Thank you for helping my daddy smile again" written in crayon. "Why did you choose this?" Victoria asked suddenly. "Margaret told me you had offers from defense contractors. You could have had a very different life." James sat on the edge of his desk, considering her question. "When I came back from my last tour, I was lost. The Marines had been my life, my purpose. I had job offers, yes, but they felt empty. Then I started volunteering here, working with other vets, and I found something I hadn't even realized I was missing." He picked up a framed photo from his desk, himself in dress blues, standing proud with his unit. "In the Marines we have a saying, never leave a man behind. For me, this work is a continuation of that promise. These men and women gave everything for their country. The least we can do is help them find their way home, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally." Victoria looked around the office again, seeing it with new eyes. No, it wasn't impressive in the way she was used to measuring success. There were no expensive paintings or mahogany furniture, but there was something else here. Something real and vital and deeply important. As she drove home that evening, Victoria's mind was churning with everything she'd seen and learned. She thought about the way Emma's face lit up whenever she talked about James, about his quiet competence during George's emergency, about the lives being transformed at the center. But most of all, she thought about value, what it meant, how to measure it, and whether she had been using the wrong metrics all along. Her certainty about what Emma needed in a partner, about what constituted success, was beginning to crack. What she didn't know was that her education in these matters was far from over. The next few weeks would bring revelations that would challenge her worldview even further, forcing her to confront her own prejudices in ways she never expected. A week after her visit to the community centre, Victoria found herself in an unexpected place, the intensive care unit at Massachusetts General Hospital. George, their gardener, had suffered another cardiac episode, this one more severe. Emma had called to let her know, and Victoria was surprised to find herself genuinely concerned about the man she'd employed for over a decade, but barely known. When she arrived at the hospital, she found James already there, sitting with an elderly woman she didn't recognize. The woman's face was worn with worry, her clothes simple but neat. James stood when he saw Victoria. "Mrs. Ashworth, this is Mrs. Harrison, George's wife, Helen." Victoria felt a moment of shame. She hadn't even known George was married. She'd never asked. Helen Harrison looked up at her with tired eyes. "George always spoke highly of you," Helen said softly. "Said you treated him with respect, unlike some of his other employers." Victoria sat down beside her, struggling to reconcile this revelation with her own memories of her interactions with George. Had she really been respectful, or had she just been politely indifferent? "The doctors say he's stable," James updated them. "The next 24 hours are critical, but they're optimistic." As they waited, Helen began to talk, perhaps to distract herself from worry. She told Victoria about how she and George had met. She was a nurse in Vietnam. He was a wounded Marine. Their love story had unfolded against the backdrop of war, culminating in a simple wedding ceremony before George's unit shipped out again. When he came home, Helen continued, her voice growing softer, he wasn't the same. The war, it changed him. For years, he struggled. Couldn't hold down a job, had terrible nightmares. Then one day he discovered gardening, something about working with the earth, creating beauty instead of destruction. It helped heal him. Victoria listened, thinking about her pristine gardens that George had tended so carefully. She'd always assumed he was just good at his job. She'd never imagined that each flower he planted was part of his own healing. "That's why the centre means so much to him," Helen added, glancing at James with gratitude. "Being able to help other veterans through the gardening program, it gave him purpose again." James excused himself to get coffee, leaving Victoria alone with Helen. After a moment of awkward silence, Helen pulled something from her purse, an old, creased photograph. "This was George in Vietnam," she said, handing it to Victoria. "Right after he earned his Silver Star." Victoria stared at the photo. The young Marine in the image bore little resemblance to the quiet gardener she knew. He stood proud in his uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They held the same quiet strength she'd sometimes glimpsed when he spoke about her roses. "Silver Star?" Victoria whispered. Helen nodded. "He saved his entire platoon during the Tet Offensive. Led them through enemy territory for 3 days, carrying a wounded comrade on his back. Never left a man behind, he said. That's the Marine way." Victoria felt her throat tighten as she remembered James saying those exact words. She looked at the photo again, then at Helen, seeing years of love and sacrifice etched in the older woman's face. Just then, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A young veteran, Victoria recognized him as Marcus from the center, was having another panic attack. He'd come to visit George, but had been triggered by the hospital environment. James immediately appeared at his side, talking him through it, just as he had at the center. As Victoria watched James calm Marcus down, Helen spoke again, her voice carrying a weight of understanding that came from years of loving a warrior. "You know, Mrs. Ashworth, when George first came home, everyone had expectations about what he should do with his life. Get a corporate job, wear a suit, act like the war never happened. But that wasn't his path to healing. He needed to find his own way, even if others didn't understand it. The parallel was unmistakable." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes as she thought about her own expectations for Emma, her dismissal of James's choices. A doctor approached then, bringing news that George was awake and stable. As Helen went to see her husband, Victoria remained in the waiting room, lost in thought. She pulled out her phone and began researching the Silver Star, reading about the extraordinary courage it represented. Then she found herself looking up James's service record. It was public information. After all, what she found stopped her heart for a moment. James Connor hadn't just served in the Marines. He'd been a Force Recon Marine, one of the elite. And there, in a heavily redacted mission report, was the reason he'd left active service. A classified operation in Afghanistan that had earned him a Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. Victoria sat there, staring at her phone, as pieces began falling into place. James's dedication to the center, his ability to connect with veterans, the respect he commanded, it all stemmed from a place of deep understanding. He wasn't just helping these veterans, he was one of them, carrying his own invisible wounds, finding his own path to healing through helping others. But the biggest revelation came when she scrolled through news archives about the mission. There, in a photo of James receiving his Navy Cross, she saw someone she recognized in the background, her own father, Colonel William Preston, who'd passed away 5 years ago. With trembling fingers, Victoria opened her father's old study at home, which she'd left unchanged since his death. In his desk drawer, she found a letter she'd never seen before, dated just weeks before he died. "My dearest Victoria," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm no longer here to tell you myself about one of the most extraordinary young Marines I've ever had the honor of knowing." The letter went on to detail how James had saved her father's life during a classified joint operation, suffering severe injuries in the process. Her father had been working as a military consultant, his last mission before retirement, when everything went wrong. James's actions hadn't just saved her father, they'd saved an entire unit and completed a mission crucial to national security. Victoria sank into her father's old leather chair, the letter shaking in her hands. All this time, she'd been judging James based on his bank account and his choice to work at a community center. She'd never imagined that he had a connection to her father, that he was the reason she'd had 5 more years with her dad. The weight of her own prejudices crashed down on her. But even this revelation, shocking as it was, wasn't the end of her journey. The coming days would bring one final lesson about value, worth, and the true meaning of service. A lesson that would change her perspective forever. Victoria spent the night in her father's study, reading and rereading his letter until the words blurred before her eyes. The morning light found her still there, surrounded by mementos of her father's military career that she'd never fully appreciated before. Each medal, each photograph, now held new meaning. They weren't just symbols of achievement, but markers of lives touched, saved, and sometimes lost. She thought about James, carrying the weight of his own service, while quietly helping others carry theirs. The more she reflected, the more she realized how blind she'd been to the kind of man her daughter had chosen. That morning, Victoria made 2 decisions. The first was to drive to the community center again, this time with purpose rather than curiosity. The second was to finally open the box of her father's personal effects that she'd been avoiding since his death. At the center, she found James in the middle of a crisis. A young veteran named Sarah was facing eviction with her 2 small children. Her PTSD had made it difficult to maintain steady employment, and now she was about to lose everything. "We're trying to find her emergency housing," James explained to Victoria, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "But everything in our price range has a waiting list." Victoria watched as Sarah hugged her children close, trying to be strong for them. The little girl was clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, while the boy wore a too big t-shirt with the Marine Corps emblem. Without hesitation, Victoria stepped forward. "I might be able to help with that." Everyone turned to look at her. She continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "I own several properties in the city through my family's trust. One of them, a small house in Dorchester, is between tenants right now. It needs some minor repairs, but it's move-in ready." James stared at her, surprise evident on his face. "Mrs. Ashworth, that's incredibly generous, but Sarah couldn't afford. The rent will be adjusted to what she can manage," Victoria interrupted. "And perhaps," she looked around the centre, seeing it with new eyes, "perhaps we could set up a program for other veterans in similar situations. I have other properties, connections with local real estate developers. We could create a housing initiative." The hope that bloomed on Sarah's face made Victoria's throat tight. James was looking at her differently now, with a mixture of surprise and respect that made her both proud and ashamed. Proud of who she was becoming, ashamed of who she'd been. Later that afternoon, after helping Sarah and her children get settled in their new home, Victoria invited James to join her at her house. She had something important to show him. In her father's study, Victoria opened the box she'd been avoiding for 5 years. Inside were her father's most personal belongings: his dog tags, photographs, and a leather-bound journal. "I found your letter," she said quietly, watching James's face. "The one my father wrote about you." James went very still. "Mrs. Ashworth." "Victoria," she corrected gently. "I think you've earned that right several times over." She pulled out her father's journal, opening it to a marked page. "He wrote about you here too, about the mission, about how you risked everything to save him and the others. Why didn't you tell me?" James's eyes were distant, focused on memories she could only imagine. "It wasn't my story to tell, not like that. Your father was a great man, Victoria. He taught me a lot about leadership, about what it means to serve with honor. He wrote that about you, you know." Victoria's voice was thick with emotion as she read from the journal. "In all my years of service, I've never met anyone who better exemplifies the core values of the Marine Corps than James Connor. His courage under fire was matched only by his humility in victory." She looked up at James, seeing him clearly for the first time. "I've been so wrong about you, about what matters. I thought I was protecting Emma, making sure she had the kind of life I thought she deserved. But you've shown me what real value looks like." James sat quietly for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn challenge coin. "Your father gave me this just before I left the service. Said it was his lucky coin, got him through 3 tours in Vietnam." He held it out to Victoria. "I think he'd want you to have it back." Victoria shook her head, closing his fingers around the coin. "Keep it. It's where it belongs." She took a deep breath. "But I would like your help with something else. I want to do more for the center, for veterans like Sarah. My father's foundation has been dormant since his death, but with the right leadership—" James's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want to reactivate the foundation with a new mission?" Victoria nodded. "Helping veterans not just survive, but thrive. Housing, education, employment, mental health support, everything they need to build the lives they deserve. Would you help me make that happen?" The moment hung between them, heavy with possibility. Then James smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "It would be an honor." As they began discussing plans for the foundation, Victoria felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She thought about Emma, about the kind of man she'd chosen, and felt a deep gratitude replace her former disappointment. But even as Victoria was beginning to understand the true measure of James's character, she had no idea that the biggest test of her newfound understanding was yet to come. The following week would bring an event that would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. 1 week after Victoria and James began planning the foundation, Emma arranged a special dinner at the community center. She said she wanted to celebrate the new partnership between her mother and James. But Victoria sensed there was more to it. The entire main hall had been transformed. The usual fluorescent lights replaced with soft lanterns, round tables covered in white cloths, and vases of fresh flowers that Victoria recognized from her own garden, undoubtedly arranged by George, who had recovered and returned to work. As Victoria entered, she was struck by the mix of people gathered there. Veterans from the centre and their families mingled with members of Boston's elite society. People Victoria had invited after sharing her vision for the foundation. Sarah was there with her children, looking more confident in a new dress that Victoria had helped her choose for job interviews. Marcus stood near his artwork, now properly framed and displayed, talking animatedly with a gallery owner about an upcoming exhibition. James appeared at Victoria's side, looking sharp in a suit that she noticed fit him perfectly. Emma's doing, no doubt. "Quite a turnout," he said, smiling. "Indeed," Victoria agreed, watching as one of her society friends engaged in an intense conversation with a veteran about urban farming initiatives. Worlds were colliding, barriers breaking down, and the energy in the room was electric with possibility. Dinner was served, a combination of elegant catering and home-cooked dishes brought by veterans' families. Victoria found herself seated between Helen Harrison and a young Marine veteran who'd recently started a successful food truck business with help from the center's entrepreneurship program. As they ate, Victoria noticed Emma and James exchanging glances, that special kind of silent communication that comes from deep connection. Finally, Emma stood, gently tapping her glass for attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "This dinner is about more than celebrating new partnerships. It's about celebrating transformation, not just of the center, but of hearts and minds." She looked at Victoria with tears in her eyes. "Mum, when I first told you about James, you saw what you thought was missing, the right background, the right kind of success. But now you see what I saw from the beginning. The true worth isn't measured by what's in your bank account, but by what's in your heart and what you give to others." Victoria felt tears welling up in her own eyes as Emma continued. "James and I have an announcement to make, but first, there's something else you all should know." Emma looked at James, who nodded and stood. "3 days ago," James said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "we received word that Marcus's art therapy program has been selected for national implementation by the VA. It will be the pilot program for a new approach to PTSD treatment, funded in part by the Preston Foundation." The room erupted in applause. Marcus, overwhelmed, was embraced by fellow veterans as tears streamed down his face. Victoria saw the pride in James's eyes as he watched his friend receive the recognition he deserved. "But that's not all," Emma said, taking James's hand. "Mum, remember how you once told me that the most important thing was finding someone who could provide the kind of life I deserved?" Victoria nodded, already feeling what was coming. "Well, you were right, just not in the way you thought." Emma's free hand went to her stomach, and Victoria's heart stopped for a moment. "James has given me the most important thing anyone could give, a purpose bigger than myself. And soon, he'll give me something else too. You're going to be a grandmother." The announcement was met with joyful cheers, but Victoria barely heard them. She was looking at her daughter, really looking at her, and seeing not the society princess she'd tried to raise, but a strong, compassionate woman who had chosen her path with wisdom. Victoria herself was only now beginning to understand. James knelt beside Victoria's chair. "I know I didn't ask for your blessing before," he said softly, "but I'm asking now. Not just for Emma and the baby, but for all of this, the foundation, the future we're building. I want our child to grow up understanding what your father knew, that true service to others is the highest calling anyone can answer." Victoria took James's hand, then Emma's, pulling them both close. "You never needed my blessing," she said through tears. "You needed me to open my eyes and see what real value looks like. Thank you for teaching me that lesson." Later that evening, as Victoria watched Emma and James dancing slowly in the center of the room, surrounded by their unique family of veterans, society friends, and chosen family, she thought about her father's letter. He had written about legacy, not the kind that comes with trust funds and social status, but the kind that lives on in lives touched and changed. She watched Sarah's children playing with other veterans' kids, saw Marcus showing his artwork to mesmerize gallery owners, observed her society friends making plans with veterans for future collaborations. This was what real success looked like, not a single achievement, but a ripple effect of positive change. Standing near the entrance, Victoria noticed a young woman in marine dress blues hesitating to enter. She walked over, recognizing the same uncertainty she'd once seen in Sarah's eyes. "Welcome," Victoria said warmly, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Ashworth. Let me introduce you to some people who understand exactly what you're going through." As she led the young Marine into the gathering, Victoria reflected on how far she'd come from that first dinner when she'd looked down on James. She'd learned that true worth isn't measured in dollars, but in impact. That real success isn't about what you have, but what you give. And that family isn't defined by blood or status, but by the bonds of understanding and support we create with others. Most importantly, she'd learned that it's never too late to open your heart and mind to new ways of seeing the world. As she watched her daughter and James surrounded by their chosen family, Victoria knew that her grandchild would grow up understanding these truths from the beginning. And that was the greatest legacy she could hope for. What would you have done in Victoria's position? Have you ever had a moment that completely changed your perspective on what truly matters in life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences might help others see things differently too. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support keeps our channel going strong, allowing us to bring you powerful, emotional stories every single day that remind us what truly matters in life. And if you're ready for another moving journey that will warm your heart and maybe even change your perspective, check out the story appearing on the left of your screen right now. Trust me, it's another emotional roller coaster that will stay with you long after it ends. Remember, every story can change a life, and every subscription helps us continue sharing these meaningful moments with you. Thank you for being part of our growing family.